Okay, welcome to week 5 lecture, Crisis in the Church. Today we're going to get into the Reformation. Okay, so up until today in lecture, up until this time, every time we've talked about the church in previous lectures, I've underscored that as far as Christian churches are concerned, there really is one game in town. The Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, is the church. Now, there are other church traditions. There are a few groups that found themselves at odds, like the Cathars, with the Catholic Church, that are labeled as heretics and end up usually dying violently as a result of trying to oppose the Catholic Church in Western Europe. There are also other Christian church traditions like the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the coming next few weeks in lecture, just a bit, that are kind of outside that structure. But for the most part, if you're talking about Christianity in Western Europe, from the Middle Ages onward, the Catholic Church was really the only option there was. Now that's going to change. There's going to be a major crisis and a series of, I guess, rebellions would be the best word you could use against the authority of the Catholic Church. Starting around 1500 or so is when it starts to get real traction. But the origins of that conflict go back even further. So let's start today looking a little bit at the roots of some of the complaints and problems and crisis and conflict inside the church. Now we're going to back up quite a ways. We're going to talk about the 1400s, for instance. This is after the Black Death has swept through Europe. It's after the church has undergone its most serious series of blows, where so many of the highly qualified clergy die. They're replaced by people who are, in some cases, absolutely unqualified. You have examples of priests being complained about because they can't read. You have people who don't really know Christian doctrine very well, putting themselves in a position to teach it to other people. You have opportunists, various corrupt individuals. It gets really, really bad. And there's just a pure logistical issue. In the years immediately following the outbreak of the Black Death, there's not enough clergy to go around, and all of the tasks that the clergy typically do, reading, writing, record keeping, education, social welfare, caring for the community, being a liaison between the community and political leadership, all of those things end up being neglected. Those jobs end up being neglected. In Central and Northern Europe, literally, in many cases, churches will have no living, working clergy. They'll apply to Rome to have a replacement sent, and the Pope simply won't have anyone or won't care or won't respond. And so you have churches that are just sitting empty with no clergy person to run them. Well, one of the groups of people who suggest that maybe we ought to consider doing things in a slightly different way, given that there aren't enough clergy to go around, given that there's so much trouble training qualified people to take their place, since everybody has to learn to read and write in Latin if they want to be qualified as a traditional Catholic clergy person. There's a group known as the Lollards. These are a group of academics, many of whom did read and write in Latin, but they argue that the requirement to perform services in Latin, to keep records in Latin, to do everything as far as the church was concerned in Latin was bad for a couple of reasons. One is the practical consideration that when there aren't enough clergy to go around, it would be immeasurably easier to replace them if you could replace clergy with other bright, educated people who didn't speak Latin. It would be a lot easier to fill vacancies. The other is a more philosophical reason. The Lollards object to conducting church services in Latin and reading the Bible to people only in Latin, which was the standard practice in Europe in the 1400s. They object to this on philosophical grounds, on theological grounds. They say this isn't right, that common people who don't understand Latin should understand their religious services. They should understand the Bible without someone having to translate it for them on the spot. which was the situation most people were in. The Bible was available in Latin, and if you didn't speak Latin, you had to ask a priest, what does this say? What does it mean? How should I understand this? And it gave the priest a tremendous amount of authority and opportunity to do all the interpretation that that person wanted to do. You could do a nun too, but you know what I'm saying. Clergy were the only people who were the source of information that people had about their own religion. So the Lollards, led by a group of charismatic academics like John Wycliffe and John Oldcastle, those are the English ones, complain. They say, no, we should have reform in the church so that services are conducted in vernacular languages, so that people who are in England, for instance, could turn up at church and hear the Mass celebrated in English. They also argue that the Bible ought to be translated so that people can read it. More people who can read and write, but can only read and write in their own local languages, should have the right to read and write the Bible. And so they advocate for translating the Bible out of Latin, and also advocate for having church services in Latin. This did not go down well with the Pope. It didn't go down well with the high clergy. They saw it as potentially dangerous. The Pope complained that if you translated the Bible into English and just any old schlub could read it, that they would inevitably come to their own conclusions about what it meant, and that they would fall into error and what's known as heresy. They'd believe the wrong thing. They'd go to hell. They'd endanger the souls of everyone around them who might also subscribe to their mistaken belief. They would challenge the authority of the church. There was no real appetite or interest in the high clergy to open the door and share authority. They wanted to be a monopoly. They wanted to be the only game in town. So the Lollards were condemned from the pulpit, and some of the leaders were rounded up. And you can see here a woodcut that shows John Oldcastle being executed. He was burned at the stake, poor guy, as a heretic. The church didn't tolerate it. They rounded him up and they had him executed. In case you're wondering why that looks so weird, this is just a weird, morbid aside, but there's more than one way to burn someone at the stake. I know this is kind of odd to talk about, but there's a compassionate way to do it, as far as you could call it compassionate, where you arrange the fire so that the smoke rises from the fire and the person is arranged in such a way that they are put into a zone where there isn't enough oxygen. So the fire burns up local oxygen, and the smoke itself contains things like carbon monoxide, various other things you can't breathe. And so what happens is that the person asphyxiates. That's how they die. They don't have enough oxygen, so they get sleepy and they fall asleep and they die. As ways to die go, it's relatively painless and relatively quick. And so if you were burned at the stake in this fashion, like John Oldcastle evidently was, that's why he's bent over in that odd way, then this was a relatively merciful way to execute people. If, however, you do it the other way, which is you arrange the fire so that the person actually burns, but the smoke and kind of zone where there isn't enough oxygen blows away from their face, then that is one of the most excruciating, horrific, horrible ways to die. So it could be either one. John Oldcastle apparently got the easy way. Okay, so here we go. All right, so there were other problems in addition to this. Now, as you can imagine, the Lollards were very popular. People coming around and saying, we really think the Bible ought to be translated and people ought to be able to read it for themselves, had a lot of traction among people who don't speak Latin. And so there were a great number of people who were very interested in supporting that motion. Similarly, there's a lot of other disappointments and concern about the church and how it was being run. In between 1309 rather, and 1376, there was this time period known as the Avignon Papacy. And you don't have to know all the details of this. We're just going to touch on it quickly and then move on. And this was what happened when the Pope and the King of France got into a big fight with each other. And then the Black Death breaks out in the middle and disrupts everything. But they get into a big fight with each other, and the King of France gets the upper hand, and he forces the Pope to relocate out of Rome into Avignon in France. And he builds him a lovely palace, there it is, but he forces him to live there and work under the eye of the King of France. And this was a huge blow to the authority of the papacy, the authority of the Pope, and also likewise to the credibility of the church as an independent institution, because what it really effectively meant was that they had to do whatever the King of France told them to. And this made it, well, it was hard to believe that they were choosing to support positions that were in the best interest of Christianity, that were legitimately what they thought was the most appropriate theologically. It was just made them look very much like pawns, and it was a blow to the authority and to the credibility of the church. In 1376, this breaks and they go back to Rome and they're independent again. But there still is a lingering concern that this situation can emerge again, that the popes are too closely tied to political figures, that they could end up under the thumb of kings and rulers like the Holy Roman Emperor. And so there was a movement in 1414 to try to counter that political effect. The movement is known as conciliarism, which is a reference to the church council. And in 1414, you see one of the first of these efforts to try to get around a possibly corrupt pope. The concern was that if there is a corrupt pope, and the pope is making decisions for all of Christianity, for all of the Christian church in the West, then you could end up having very bad, morally corrupt decisions being made. So the Council of Constance was an effort to try to limit that, to limit the powers of the pope, and to limit the damage that a single bad pope could do, or a corrupt pope could do. So the idea behind it was that all of the high clergy, all of the bishops and archbishops, would occasionally get together and have a council. And then all of the issues that affected the church, what should be our position on defending Jewish populations? What should be our position on the nature of the Trinity? What should be our position on attacking heretics? Whatever it is you're debating, all of the clergy would together in council discuss that, debate it, and then vote on what to do. And that the decisions of these councils should be the decisions that determined the conduct of the church going forward. That was the idea behind conciliarism. As you can imagine, this doesn't go anywhere. The King of France, who's interested in keeping the Pope under his thumb, fights it tooth and claw. And the rest of the kings of Europe are also against it. Even if they don't like or trust the King of France, they don't like this idea even worse, because it's the nightmare of these kings and emperors to have a truly powerful, independent church possibly foiling their plans left and right. And so pretty much all of the royalty of Europe are going to band together to try to fight and discourage this. They put pressure on their own local clergy. They are going to cause all kinds of problems. And eventually this conciliarism movement kind of dies out. It trickles off because they can't get enough support and there's too much pressure from royal authority. Okay, so more stuff that makes the church look bad. Ready? The Inquisition. Now, the institution of the Inquisition had been around from the 1200s. It was created by Innocent III, the same pope that taught kings to be afraid of independent popes, Innocent III, the one who put John, the one and only of England, in his place, the Magna Carta guy. He had come up with the Office of the Inquisition, and the purpose of it was to eradicate heresy, people who believed differently than the official church authorities felt they should. So if they had a different idea of what the nature of Jesus was or the Trinity, but basically religious issues, that they believed in different ways or they believed different ideas. And so the Inquisition's job was to identify people who had these, in the mind of the Catholic Church, erroneous beliefs, confront them, and then correct their behavior. And when it was instituted in Italy, that was really what it did. And it was an institution that didn't have the same kind of reputation for incredible harshness that most modern people think of when you hear the word Inquisition. I can give you an example, and I'll try to make this as quick as I can. There's a transcript that survives from a series of court cases involving a guy in Italy. Domenico Scandella was his name. His nickname was Minocchio. And he runs afoul of the Italian Inquisition, and the records of that survive. Now, here was the story of Minocchio. He had his own personal idea that he seemed to have invented for himself, that the universe was actually made up of this weird, amorphous, shapeless substance that was kind of like cheese. And that God and the angels were like worms that just kind of like lived in the cheese and went in and out and were crawling all over the place. This was his idea. I know you're probably wondering where we're going with this, but that's his idea. And he was starting to tell everybody about this, all of his neighbors, about God and the worms and the cheese. And he was driving them nuts. They're like, we can't stop telling us this. This is blasphemous and it's obnoxious and we don't want to hear it. So, and this is how you got in trouble with the Inquisition. His neighbors went and complained about him. They're like, this guy keeps telling us about the cheese and the worms, and it's very irritating and it's blasphemy, and you got to make him stop. And then you see the record where the Inquisition's officials are asking questions of the neighbors first. And they're like, well, is he joking? Is it a joke? Because if it's a joke, maybe we'll yell at him a little, but you can't take things too seriously. If it's a joke, it's a joke. And they're like, no, he's serious. And then they're like, yeah, but is he crazy? Because if he's insane, then, there's nothing really you can do. You're just going to have to put up with this. And the neighbor's like, no, he's not insane. He's a successful businessman. He seems totally rational in other areas of his life. He's just convinced of this. And they're like, okay, get him in. And so he's collected and he's brought in front of the inquisitors, and they ask him some questions, and he spills out the whole story about the cheese and the worms. Initially he denies it, but then he's like, no, I admit it, here's my whole view. And they listen to him, and at the end they're like, okay, well, you know that's heresy, right? It's blasphemous. And he's like, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. And they're like, well, you can't tell people this. The Inquisition doesn't even tell him he can't think it. They tell him he can't tell people this. That was the rule. And he's like, okay, fine. And so the punishment was that he had to sew a yellow letter H on his clothes so that everyone would know he's a heretic and not to listen to him. And then they let him go, and he was just off doing whatever he wanted. And you'd think, hey, you'd be scared. You'd think, all right, that's a near miss. I'm going to behave myself after this. But no. Pinocchio immediately begins telling everybody about the cheese and the worms again. So he gets rearrested. And the Inquisition's like, look, we had this whole discussion. This is heresy. You can't be telling people this. If somebody believes you, they could end up going to hell because they have turned their back on correct doctrine. And he's like, well, I'm sorry. So they put him in jail for a little bit longer this time, but eventually they let him go again after they think maybe he's learned his lesson. And off he goes again and immediately starts telling everybody about the cheese and the worms again. At this point, he's rearrested, and the Inquisition washes their hands of him, and they're like, look, there's nothing we can do about you, I guess. And so he's eventually executed. Now, that's the kind of thing you expect with the Italian Inquisition. You have somebody who is believing things the church can't support. They're, counseled, they're lectured, they're threatened, and basically there's an effort to try to correct that belief and stop heretics from spreading their views. What happens in the late 1400s in Spain is something completely different and completely horrible. The Spanish Inquisition came out of a totally separate tradition. It was something that was created at the request of Spanish clergy, kind of pushed, one could argue, by Spanish politicians. They requested from the Pope the right to start an inquisition to catch people who believe falsely, and the Pope gave them permission to do this. So they set up a tribunal. What makes the Spanish Inquisition different is that they weren't looking for weird crackpots like Domenico Scandella. Instead, who they were targeting, were people who had converted to Christianity and might therefore be harboring secret sympathies for Judaism or for Islam. And the reason there were so many people that they needed an inquisition to target these conversos, as they were known, had to do with a law passed in 1492, the Alhambra Decree. Up until this point, Spain had been divided into various, kingdoms and caliphates. And in 1492, the Kingdom of Granada was conquered, and the Alhambra Decree was issued. And in it, Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Aragon and Castile, completed what they would describe as the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain. So now it is all under Christian management, if you will. And in the Alhambra Decree, what it basically says is that if you want to live in Spain, you have to be Christian. There was a slight dispensation for Muslims living in a few protected areas. This was part of the condition of the surrender of Granada. But if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim and not living in one of these protected areas, you have two choices now. Well, three. You have two choices. You can leave Spain, leaving your family and your property and everything you've ever known, very likely, and go somewhere else. Or you can be arrested for heresy and executed. That was your deal. Now, the third possibility is one that the Spanish Inquisition was afraid people were doing. This was the fear that they might be converting to Christianity, claiming that they were converting, but not actually converting. And so this sort of paranoia, this fear that people might have been false converts, is going to drive Spanish people to create this panel to investigate, to find out if there are these false converts everywhere. Now, this is a terrible situation, and it gets out of control. Number one, they're targeting people based on not necessarily good evidence. This isn't a case where people are running around trying to convert secretly other people to Judaism or something like that. Instead, you get turned into the Inquisition kind of like Domenico Scandella got turned in by your neighbors, very likely. But here's where it gets really nasty. If the person who gets turned into the Spanish Inquisition is convicted of heresy or of blasphemy, of being a false convert, then not only will they be executed, and none of this like being lectured and released 2 or 3 times first. No, they'll just be tortured and executed. Not only are they going to be executed, but their property is divvied up. Some of it is seized by the government of Spain, and some of it is given out as a reward to whoever turned them in. So now you have an incentive to turn in any neighbors you didn't like. And especially if you've always been kind of had an attitude about them because their family used to be Muslim way back, or Jewish or whatever, it's an excellent opportunity to enjoy and explore your religious bigotry, if you will. And some of the evidence that was given that a family, for instance, might not be a real convert was really circumstantial. So you would have people who were condemned because they were observed to not eat pork, for instance, because that's forbidden both in Judaism and Islam. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with your religious views. It's entirely possible that if you grew up never eating pork and you don't know how to cook pork and you've always thought of it as kind of dirty and forbidden, even if you were to change your religion, you wouldn't run right out and buy some pork. There's nothing in Christianity that says you've got to eat it. It's just not forbidden. And so things like this made people vulnerable, that they could be accused. And then, this is where it really gets out of hand. The process of determining whether someone was guilty. The accused person would be brought in. Then they would be subjected to torture to find out whether they were willing to confess to being a false convert. Here's the problem with torture, is that it is an incredibly, not only is it morally awful, but it's an incredibly unreliable way to get truthful information out of people. Once you start torturing them, as the Spanish Inquisition did, people will almost universally confess to whatever it is you promise you'll stop torturing them if they confess to. I'm sorry, that was awkwardly put. But basically, they all confess to get you to stop torturing them. All of them. And it gets worse because not only does everybody get convicted who's accused, which is just ridiculous, but the Inquisition gets as out of hand as it ends up getting in Spain because the torturers are not just going to demand that people confess, they're going to put another question to them. Are you a secret Jew or Muslim? And then the next question follow up. Who else do you know is a secretly not Christian but pretending to be Christian? People under torture will say anything. They're out of their mind with pain and fear. And the next thing you know, they'll just name random names. And then those people are brought in and tortured. And then they name names. And the next thing you know, it's thousands of innocent people rounded up, tortured, and executed. And it's fed by this fear of people whose family backgrounds included people who were Jewish or Muslim. It's fed by all kinds of political insecurities. It's fed by economic insecurities, where some families are targeted because they're prosperous or because they're rivals or whatever other reason. It's just a flaming disaster. And you also have, because of the Alhambra Decree in 1492, a huge wave of people, particularly Jewish people, who are going to leave Spain. And this is going to end up biting Spain in the butt down the line because, well, it's a long story. And rather than get totally suckered into it, we're going to move on. But the short version is that with the rise of trade guilds and craft guilds, Europe in general, including Spain, had been closing more and more and more avenues of making a living to people who were non-Christian. So if you were Jewish or Muslim, but particularly Jewish in most of Europe, you wouldn't be allowed to join the stonemasons guild. You wouldn't be allowed to join the carpenters guild. You wouldn't be allowed to join merchants guilds. You wouldn't be allowed to join any of these professional organizations. And so you'd be effectively boxed out of doing that for a living. In some places like Spain, you'd be now forbidden to own land, and so you'd be boxed out of farming in a profitable way to make a living. You could only really be a tenant farmer, which is a miserable job, or you were forced into jobs that Christians found distasteful one way or another. Some of them end up being prestigious, like doctors, but that's going to come down the line. And others involved things like money lending, banking, economic, merchant activity, that kind of thing. And so it doubles up. People in Spain have a doubled disdain for people who might be Jewish before the Alhambra Decree, because not only are they non-Christian, but also they're in these icky jobs, money lending, where nobody trusts a banker whether they're Christian or not. That's the deal. And what happens in 1492, and this is why I say it's gonna bite them in the butt, is you have the more prosperous Jewish population are going to leave Spain in a big old wave because they have the resources to go somewhere else. Actually, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire is going to take in a whole bunch of people and gloat about it later, because he's like, haha, suckers, I got your good people, they're awesome. Anyway, but nevertheless, they're going to leave. And the problem is that they're going to bring every expert who knew anything about macroeconomics with them when they go. And Spain is about to embark on a whole series of terrible economic decisions led by people who don't have any idea how money and economies and banking works. And it's going to blow up in their face. It's going to be great. Anyway, so sorry for the editorializing. This is going on. And outside Spain, people are looking over and they're like, what are you doing? How are you? The church is just killing people. They're murdering. They're just rounding people up and executing them. They can't all be guilty. You're burning them at the stake for little pretext. This is out of control. And so, as bad as it was in Spain, people who were in the middle of Central Europe were looking over, going, just aghast that the church was being used as this tool of corruption and persecution and general cruelty. So that's another problem. Then you have the popes. As I mentioned last time, we talked about this a little bit. The office of the papacy is going through a tough time as an institution that you can put a lot of respect in. Rodrigo Borgia, we talked about him last time, becomes the pope. He spends his whole papacy investing in his warlord of a son and his black widow of a daughter, where she's married to a guy who ends up murdered and then she's married to somebody else. At any rate, it looks awful. And anybody who knows what's going on with the Pope and with the high clergy in Rome is horrified and scandalized by it. If you are a sincere, hardworking, devout Christian clergy person, if you're the Bishop of Maine or the Bishop of Aachen or the bishop of wherever, you're looking to the south going, what is happening? Things are out of control. What is going on? The church is just in the hands of these corrupt institutions, these corrupt people who are flattering the Medici and other sort of banking families at the expense of the actual Christian population. The whole thing is really rough and it's going really badly. all of the efforts to try to correct that, to try to rein it in, to be like, let's stop building lavish, fantastic buildings and painting every inch of every surface in every church with lavish Michelangelo paintings. How about let's rededicate ourselves to, I don't know, spiritual service? People like Savonarola are going to start trying to push back. And what happens to them? The Pope doesn't like to be criticized, so he ends up burned at the stake. That's obviously an oversimplification, but it's as good a sort of a thing to remember as any. Savonarola, just to remind you, was the one who becomes a very popular preacher in Florence, who convinces people to turn their back on worldly things that are leading them into sinfulness. And so the reason historians and art historians in particular hate this guy is because he starts up what's known as the bonfires of the vanities, where if you have novels or paintings or things you think are leading you into sinfulness, you can bring them down and throw them on the fire. So historians don't like him, but he was very popular and he was encapsulating something that a lot of people felt in his day, was that the leadership of the Catholic Church was corrupt, that they were leading Christians astray into sinfulness, into wallowing in luxury, and that it needed to be checked somehow. Savonarola raises his voice. He doesn't criticize the Pope directly. He's not stupid, but he starts making these comments that the Pope finds offensive, and the next thing you know, burned at the stake. All right. And then that leads us to the next pope in our list of terrible popes. We have Leo X. He's an actual son of Lorenzo de' Medici. So the Medici pull their strings, they throw around enough money, and they get the Pope elected out of their own family. Now, Leo X had no interest in being a spiritual leader. He's quoted, he may be misquoted, but his quote that's attributed to him is, "Since God has given us the papacy, let's enjoy it." He didn't have the warlord son, at least, but he spent his whole career as Pope, holding lavish parties, going hunting, generally enjoying the life of a wealthy nobleman. He had a pet elephant, for crying out loud. And he also invested, typical Medici, in lavish building projects after lavish building project after lavish building project, including redoing the Basilica of St. Peter, one of the original churches in Rome. And he wants to redo it in a lavish Renaissance style and make it a glorious crowning achievement. And it all cost a flipping fortune. So he decides we've got to come up with a way to raise money. What does he come up with? Well, he has this brand new, fantastic idea for fundraising called the sale of indulgences. Indulgences are a new product that the Pope has invented the idea of that involves a recollection of that theory I talked about a few weeks ago, where popes claim to have authority. Remember when we talked about the crusade? So popes claim to have special authority in the Catholic Church because they've inherited the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Remember that, the Petrine doctrine? Well, Leo's going to pull that sucker out again. And he's like, well, if I've got the keys to the kingdom of heaven, how about I use them to make some money? Here's how it goes. If you're willing to buy an indulgence, it's a papal pardon, which means that whatever sin you've committed, and I don't have to know what it is, frankly, if you give me your money, I'll give you a piece of paper with the official stamp of the Pope on it. And that piece of paper will guarantee that you are excused from whatever sin you have committed up until that point. You can buy them for yourself. You can buy them for your dead relatives. Sometimes they're given like time limits, like this is good for 10,000 years out of purgatory. Whatever. Sometimes it's more of a blanket indulgence, but basically it is selling forgiveness, selling salvation for straight up money. You don't even have to go on crusade and slaughter people who aren't Christian. There's no personal sacrifice involved here. All you have to do is spend your money and you get your paper and it's get out of purgatory free. That was the idea behind indulgences. And in order to promote this idea, the Pope is going to hire specific preachers, known as indulgence sellers. The most famous of them is Johann Tetzel. And they go from town to town in Europe and preach sermons from the pulpit of the local church. The Pope issues orders that these indulgence sellers are to be given the floor. That the typical homily, the typical sermon that would have been read out from the local clergy person that Sunday should be suspended, and instead the indulgence preacher gets all the time they want to tell the congregation how they ought to buy these indulgences, and they lay on the guilt trip super thick, like your great Aunt Sally is languishing in purgatory. How can you turn your back on your dead mother or brother or cousin or whatever? Don't you want them to get into heaven? Don't you want to help them out of their suffering? How can you sit on your money when you could buy this indulgence? It is shocking. It is a shocking idea. And as you can imagine, there are a great many sincere clergy in Europe that just stand there with their mouths hanging open when they're informed that the Pope is trying to sell people salvation. One of the people who was not just shocked, not just appalled, but made incandescently angry by the selling of indulgences, the sheer nerve of selling people salvation, is this guy, Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther had a colorful personality and an exciting biographical history. His professional career started out as an Augustinian monk. So he was a monk, lived in a monastery, and he joined the monastery because he was deeply interested in the scholarly aspect of religious life. He wanted to study religious texts. He wanted to study the writings of the ancient church fathers. He wanted to really immerse himself in deep philosophical questions. This was his bread and butter. This is what he liked. And he loved that aspect of being a monk. And that's the reason he chose an Augustinian order. Now, I know this seems like it's odd, random information, but it is relevant. Augustinian monks are preoccupied. It's one of the things that they focus on their studies are the works of a bishop of North Africa, Hippo was the place, named St. Augustine. Well, he's later sainted, so he becomes known as St. Augustine. And Augustine is a natural choice for someone like Luther, who's interested in the deep, big philosophical questions, because Augustine takes on real, seriously huge issues in a lot of his writing. Things like, why does God let bad things happen to good people, and so on and so forth. And Augustine takes on a lot of these issues, and that was exactly the kind of thing Luther was interested in. Now, I'm going to take a tiny moment to make an aside about something that, honest to God, will be relevant, so just bear with me here. One of the issues that St. Augustine takes on in his Confessions, which is one of his autobiographical works where he talks about the process of wrestling with his doubts to become a Christian. One of the big questions that Augustine raises in his Confessions has to do with free will. Augustine asks the question, how do you reconcile an all-powerful God with the notion that humans have free will? See if I can put that more clearly. In other words, if God knows everything and is all-powerful, then logically, God is not limited by the same things that limit human understanding. Human beings exist within finite boundaries. We can only see what our eyes can see. We can only hear what our ears can hear. We exist in a moment in time because that is just how humans experience the world. So we can think about the past, we can remember the past, we can imagine the future, but we only exist in one singular instant in time, in the present. And the rest of time is not accessible to us. But if God is truly all-powerful, if God is truly all-knowing, then time cannot be a limitation that God works within. God must therefore exist in some way outside of time or beyond time, if you will. And so therefore, notions like past and future don't really apply. And since God knows everything and is not limited by time, Then, if you're really thinking hard, you may realize that everything that you will ever do or say or think has, in some fashion, already happened in the mind of God. God already knows what's going to happen. And if that's true, Augustine asks, do we really have free will? Now this he puts out as a paradox. And Augustine is like, okay, this is a kind of a hard question, but I just had to come to terms with the fact that it's a paradox, it's really hard to figure this out. But yes, as far as we're concerned, we have free will because even though God knows this, we don't, and he's letting it play out as it plays out. And so therefore, just don't worry about it. Just don't think about it too hard. This is the kind of thing Martin Luther liked to contemplate too. And he's going to work and chew over this issue as well. He's going to think about it. And in the end, he's going to more or less come down on Augustine's side. It will be relevant later. That's why I'm telling you this story now. Anyway, that's the sort of thing Martin Luther got used to as a monk. But he hated everything else about being a monk. He hated the whole poverty thing. He hated the whole chastity thing. He hated the whole obedience thing, especially the obedience thing. Martin Luther had a difficult personality. He was the kind of person that didn't take orders well. And he was the kind of person who really struggled with trying to follow the instructions of anybody he didn't think was as smart as he was. And he didn't think very many people were as smart as he was. So he leaves the monastery. He's like, screw this, I'm done. And so he leaves the monastery and he goes out into the world. And he's like, well, I'm highly educated. So I guess my next step in my career, I should set myself up as a university teacher. And that was something you easily could do. At the time, universities existed, but they were much less formal and much less kind of centrally organized than they are now. And so Martin Luther takes his A+ education and he goes to the town of Wittenberg and he sets himself up as a teacher. And all you had to do if you wanted to do this was basically hang up a poster that says, "Hi, I'm Martin Luther. Here's my background. I'm teaching a class on Augustine's Confessions. It's on Tuesday nights, $20, show up, that's the deal." And any student who was interested, who happened to be hanging around Wittenberg, which was a university town, would see this and be like, well, I'd like to do that. And so they'd show up and take your class. This is the kind of way you'd make a living as a university instructor. You had to basically court the students to come to your classes, and then you got paid by the head. And so because that's how it worked, there was an element of competitiveness in university areas, so that if there were more than one, if there was several professors trying to teach on the same subject, for instance, you had to compete in order to get the students to come to your class instead of Professor so-and-so's class. And in order to do this, it was not at all uncommon for different university professors, some of whom had differences of opinions, to get involved in debates with each other and get into an argument about whose interpretation of Augustine's Confessions was the more correct. And they'd get into an argument about what it all means, etc., and so forth. And then students would watch this and then choose who they wanted to attend class with based on who did better in these arguments. It could even sometimes break out in classes itself. So Martin Luther could sneak into the class of another lecturer and then jump up in the middle and then get into a big knockdown, throwdown argument about whether that professor is wrong in their interpretation of some passage or another. It sounds like a very exciting way to have classes. Martin Luther is an extremely successful professor because he's great at this. He's fantastic in very loud, forceful, fearsome debate. So here's some things you need to know about Luther that we've added up so far. He's a deeply educated and highly devout, you should just take my word on that, person with a clerical background. He was a monk at one point, and he has subsequently made his living getting involved in serious academic debate with other masters of clerical learning. So he has a lot of kind of skills under his belt. He hears about the indulgences and he is beside himself with fury. He's so angry, he's so offended by what he sees as outright blasphemy that he composes a text known as the 95 Theses. Basically, it's 95 arguments. If you read the entire thing, it should be posted up on Blackboard. If it's not, I'll put it there. If you read the entire thing, what you may notice about the 95 Theses is that it's about, 6, 8 theses maybe that are restated about 90 times. It's kind of repetitive, but in it, Luther sets out all of the arguments he can think of as to why indulgences are heretical, blasphemous, wrong, and the Pope was wrong ever to suggest it. Now, he tries, we'll go over this when we talk about our reading a bit. He tries to hold himself back just slightly, where he's like, well, if the Pope only knew, the Pope must not know that people like Johann Tetzel are out there telling people they can get right out of purgatory. If he knew, he'd be horrified. Now, Martin Luther knows that isn't true. You know he knows that isn't true. But he still says it in the, I guess, basic, bare minimum kind of hopeful way that maybe he won't get burned as a heretic if he throws it in there that it's maybe not the Pope who's wrong, but, some lesser preacher. But it's really half-hearted, and he loses his grip several times and just starts ranting, and it's pretty funny. At any rate, he writes this, he circulates it as an open letter. Eventually, it first was sent off to some clergy people and then ends up circulating publicly. There's a legend that it was tacked to the church door in Wittenberg, and that's likely not to be true, but still, it's a good story. At any rate, it circulates around, people read it, and it sets basically a match to a pile of kindling that's already there. People were furious. They had it with church leaders they saw as corrupt. They'd had it with abuses by the Catholic Church. They'd had it with the neglect of the Catholic Church, especially in Central Europe. There were all these churches where the post of the priest was vacant because they just didn't have anybody who could fill that position. They had all these churches where tithes were being collected year after year after year. That's sort of 10% of your income you paid into the church, but the church wasn't doing anything they were supposed to be doing to support the population. They weren't holding up their end of the bargain. And instead, you had popes that are interested in building lavish cathedrals and bankrolling their warlord sons, and the Spanish Inquisition that's just slaughtering people left and right. People were mad. They were furious. They were looking for an excuse. And then you come around with this freaking offensive indulgence thing, and it just kicks off. Okay, so as you can imagine, the Pope is none too pleased with Luther. They don't like this critique. He doesn't like the whole challenge to authority business. So this guy is put in the middle. This is Charles V. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. He's technically the overlord that controls most of Central Europe at this point. France is separate, but everything from France eastward until you get into what is now Russia, really. It varies, but basically the whole swath of Central Europe is more or less under his oversight. He doesn't effectively control every bit of it. His nobles are persistent in their resistance to his rule, but he technically is in charge. He is going to be the person that the Pope calls on to do something about Luther. They're like, Charles, you're the king. You can't allow the church to be challenged in this way. You can't allow the Pope to be challenged in this way, because if the church's authority is undermined, that undermines your authority too, because kings and emperors and the papacy have been hand in glove for centuries and centuries and centuries. Undermining one of us undermines us both, so you've got to do something. Charles has a lot of problems on his plate at the moment. His family are known as the Habsburgs, and they have inherited not just Central Europe as the Holy Roman Emperor, they've inherited big chunks of the rest of Europe as well. Remember how I mentioned a big fish in a small gene pool? Everybody's intermarried to everybody else. Well, Charles V had inherited not only Central Europe as the Holy Roman Emperor, which he kind of half controls. He's also inherited the southern part of Italy and Spain, and eventually he'll end up, we're not even going to get into Portugal, and the Netherlands. And so all of this is on his plate, and he's got to deal with it all. And now the Pope is calling him up, like, do something about Luther. Charles gives a big heaving sigh, and he's like, fine, I'll do something about Luther. He's stirring up trouble. You would expect at this point, if you look back at the history of what's happened to people who get into fights with popes, you have the Lollards, John Wycliffe and John Oldman burned at the stake. You have Savonarola, who is just obliquely critical of the Pope, burned at the stake. You had John, the King of England, back in 1215, gets into a fight with the Pope. He ends up only hanging on to his kingdom by the skin of his teeth. People who go up against the church end up regretting it usually. You'd expect Luther would be next on the line to get burned at the stake, but he's not. And this is why. Frederick the Wise, the Duke of Saxony, he is one of the vassals of the Holy Roman Emperor, but he's not happy about that. Charles controls so much territory, and he's afraid that the Holy Roman Emperor is going to become a more powerful style of ruler. And so he and a lot of other vassals inside the Holy Roman Empire feel like now is the time to make their move. If they have a chance to limit the power and expansion of the power of the Holy Roman Emperor, they better do it. And they also had legitimate and sincere concerns about the church. They were upset about corruption. They were upset about the direction the church had been moving. They were upset about it. And so it's two motives combined. They had political suspicion and political resistance that they wanted to put in against the Holy Roman Emperor and his power. They also had legitimate religious concerns. And so Frederick the Wise basically stretches out his neck and says, no, Luther has some good points, and I understand you'd love to shut him up, Pope. I understand that you'd love to do the Pope's bidding, Charles, but I'm not going to let you do that. I offer him protection. I'm going to let him stay with me, and if you want him, you're going to have to come with your army and pull him out of my fortress. And Charles V doesn't want to do that. He's like, I don't really want to fight with Saxony, and if I attack Saxony, the other vassals will go. And as it turns out, the religious component is a major contributing factor. Martin Luther, once he takes refuge with Frederick, is going to be able to take advantage of a new invention that had really started gaining traction in Europe at this time. The movable type printing press, the version that ends up getting used in really widespread production is the Gutenberg printing press. Basically what it is, it's a big table with like individual letters that are all kind of cut out and carved. And then to make a page, you just set all the letters into a tray that make up the words that you want. And then you ink the sheet and then you stamp it, and you can make as many copies of that page as you want. It's still a fairly time-consuming process to make a whole book, like a Bible. As you can see there, that's a Gutenberg Bible right there in the picture. But it nevertheless is a much faster, much easier process than hand lettering every single one, which is the only other way you can make books or pamphlets or anything else. And so, especially when you're talking about short pamphlets, single pages, you can produce them much, much faster. Also, paper begins being produced, wood pulp paper and cloth pulp paper in much larger quantities around the same time, largely as a result of the printing press and its spread. And so it makes it possible for that newly rising middle class that we'd already started talking about when we talked about the economic change of merchant classes and more people living in cities. So all of these things come together in this kind of perfect storm. You have a bigger group of ordinary people who can read that didn't learn to read through the church. You have a lot of people who are angry and disappointed with the direction that the church has been moving in. And some of them are clergy. They're Catholic clergy that are just ticked off at what their leadership is doing. And then you have this political component where you have people like Frederick the Wise who would like to challenge the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. So all of those things pour into one. They all come together in one big mess. And then it's going to play out in a way that Europe had not seen it play out before. The church demands Luther appears to answer for the crimes of challenging the authority of the Pope, blasphemy, heresy, all that kind of jazz. Luther, as you can imagine, declines. The church really wants him to stand trial. So they're like, okay, so here's the deal. We'll give you the following promise. If you show up at the town of Worms, it's pronounced Worms but spelled worms. If you show up at the town of Worms, we will have an imperial diet, which is just a meeting, where we will have a discussion of your viewpoints, have a little debate, and then decide what to do about you. But we promise that you can have safe passage. He's given a safeguard so that no matter what we decide, you'll be allowed to leave Worms and go back to take refuge with Frederick the Wise, the Duke of Saxony, again, no matter what. So Luther says, cool then, fine. I'm looking forward to having this discussion because I freaking love debates. So he shows up at Worms, which is known as the Diet of Worms, or looks like Diet of Worms. And he makes his case. He lays it out there. And as you can imagine, the clergy who've been appointed to argue with him are having none of it. They won't listen. And Luther is condemned as a heretic and a blasphemer. His work is described, is banned immediately and burned ceremonially. And in the Edict of Worms, this is the imperial government is going to issue this. He's declared as excommunicated and a heretic and somebody who should probably be executed for his heresy, but he can't be because Frederick the Wise is protecting him. So Luther is going to leave Worms and head on home. He goes back to Wartburg Castle, which is where Frederick is putting him up. And from there, any little hint of restraint that you can pick out in the 95 Theses, for instance, where Luther's kind of holding himself back by saying that maybe the Catholic Church has some things going for it, he completely dispenses with. He no longer cares. So, as for me, the die is cast. I despise alike the favor and fury of Rome. I don't wish to be reconciled with her or hold any communication with her. Let her condemn and burn my books. I, in turn, unless I can find no fire, will condemn and publicly burn the whole pontifical law, that swamp of heresies. Luther's any hint of constraint is gone now, and he starts issuing pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet, letters, essays, treatises, all about every complaint he's been bottling up for all these years where he thinks the Catholic Church is wrong about things. And he just dumps it into basically the eager waiting hands of the reading public. And it is a moment that was ripe. I mean, everyone was ready for this. There are so many other clergy people. There are so many other educated secular leaders who were ready to hear this kind of thinking and teaching, that they're going to snap it up and his ideas are going to spread like wildfire. And on top of that, these two things always hand in hand. Not only are his ideas going to spread like crazy, but this political arm, the idea of a vassal like Frederick the Wise breaking with the Holy Roman Emperor's instructions on religious grounds, had enormous appeal. Ordinary people have tremendous sympathy with Luther and Luther's ideas. So a little too much for Luther's taste. They have enormous sympathy with Luther. They also have critique of the Catholic Church. And so when you go to peasants and say, I'm defying the emperor, but don't worry, we're in the right. I'm doing it for this religious reason. I'm doing it for this noble reason. It's an automatic, boost to your credibility. It makes you look better. It makes it look like you have a better reason. And in some cases, it is a legitimate concern out of religious issues that is driving some of the vassals to do as they do. But in other cases, it's not necessarily. You have a lot of political, I guess you could call them upper nobles, who are worried about the increasing power of kings and emperors. They want to push back, and this is a ready-made, perfect, good excuse to do that. And that doesn't mean that they're not sincerely worried about the direction the Catholic Church has been going. It doesn't mean they don't sincerely agree with some of Luther's changes. They very well might. But there definitely is a moment of political advantage for them, where they can use this fracture to push and drive a wedge between themselves and their overlord. They can use it to gather up more power at the expense of the emperor, and they're going to jump on that. They're going to do it. Now, before we move on, I mentioned there was a little bit, perhaps too much sympathy in the peasant classes. This really comes back to bite Luther a little bit, and this is going to be part of our reading. Luther's ideas center around the notion, once he's broken with the Catholic Church, They center around the idea that you can't be compelled to act against your conscience in any ethical way, and that tradition is not a legitimate justification for authority. So, in other words, the Pope can't simply say, I've inherited the job of St. Peter, therefore I have the power of St. Peter, therefore you all have to obey me, like it or not, whether I'm good or not. Luther says that's ridiculous. There's no real justification for ideas like that. You do not have to obey people just because they occupy some inherited job. That's dumb. And so he rants about this. Peasants are going to come along, and some of them are concerned primarily with religious matters. They're paying these tithes to the church, which they can ill afford, and yet they're not really getting anything back and they want something done. So Luther is behind them in that way. On the other hand, clever peasants, who, after all, are just as likely to be clever as anyone else, hear about Luther's ideas, they read Luther's writing, and they say, wait. What you're arguing here is something I have always privately suspected or believed. Inherited status is no justification for authority. So, in other words, just because my landlord is the great, 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 great grandson of some guy that served with the Charlemagne, that doesn't mean that this guy has the right to control my political destiny. This doesn't mean that this guy has a right to control everything about my life. I don't want this anymore. I'm not want to handle it. And this comes at a perfectly, I guess, disrupted time. The Black Death did a lot, especially in the western part, what is later France, of Europe, to disrupt those old ways of tenant farming, to disrupt that feudal system where peasants and serfs are tied to the land, and generation after generation of the same families live in the same cottages working for the same landlords. A lot of that had been disrupted by the Black Death, and peasants had moved along and started demanding wages and going to better situations if better situations came up. But by 1525, the population of Europe had rebounded. They were back to pre-plague levels and beyond. And those favorable working conditions where landlords were scrambling to get workers in order to turn a profit had dried up. Wages were falling, and a lot of people who were farm workers were finding it difficult to get steady, reliable work. And then all of those traditional feudal, medieval guarantees that landlords used to have to provide for people. Used to have to provide them housing, and they used to have to provide them access to the good farm equipment, and all of the perks that had been what made the system work for centuries had been broken down in this new wage labor business. So the guarantees, the stability was gone, evaporated principally, and yet now labor conditions and salaries and wages had fallen to the point where you have a lot of peasants not able to make a living, and people who can't make a living become violent very easily. And so when Martin Luther comes along and says you shouldn't have you shouldn't have control and authority just because you've inherited some dumb job. That's not how it works. You should have to justify your position one way or another. They leap on that and they're like, ha, this should be applied to politics too. I should have more control over my political destiny. I should have some kind of representative government that I can turn to. I should have some of the legal protections that people enjoy in towns. And so you have in 1525 a big wave of peasant rebellions. This is a problem for Luther because he owes his literal life to the fact that a big fat feudal lord, well, not to say he's fat, he was, but that's not the point. Frederick the Wise is protecting him and offering him shelter. The last thing Frederick wants is all his peasants rebelling. And so the last thing Luther wants is peasants rebelling and making his boss mad at him. So Luther tries to backpedal, and we'll talk about that with the reading. Okay, other details. Luther's going to attack a lot of the principles that are applied to Catholic Church clergy and Catholic doctrine. Number one, he's going to reject the special authority of the clergy. He's like, the clergy don't have any special status with God. Instead, he institutes something known as the priesthood of all believers. He says that, look, if you believe in God, then you are equal in the eyes of God. That you don't have any special pull. He's not going to listen to you more because you have studied a lot or because you've taken holy orders. That's not how it works. If you believe in God, you are one of the priesthood of all believers. You're equally good. You're equally entitled to the blessings and grace of God. And because that's the case, clergy don't have any claim to supernatural authority. They might have special authority in the sense that they're better educated and better informed, but only if that's true, and only judged case by case on their own merits. And the only way you can know whether that's true is by comparing what they tell you, what they teach, how they present themselves, with the one authority that every Christian should respect: Scripture. He says this is the only authority we are ethically bound to. Sola Scriptura, Scripture alone. You should read the Bible, you should read the Gospels, you should read the letters of Paul, etc., and you should conform your life to the teachings you find there. And you should compare any religious teaching to what you find there, and that's the only thing you should use as your authority. Monks and nuns don't have any special holiness. There's no point in them in Luther's system. He's like, there's really no point in having a whole house of people who do nothing but live separately and pray for the salvation of others. That's silly. It's not that you shouldn't study. He still encourages that. But he's like, but living separately and not getting married, taking vows of celibacy is pointless and dumb. Instead, clergy should marry. And that includes not only the people who are secular clergy, priests and bishops and whatnot, but also monks and nuns. They should give up being monks and nuns and they should come out and get married to each other. Luther's ideas were so persuasive, in fact, that he does convince the members of several different monasteries to do this. And that's the story obliquely of his own marriage. There was a double monastery. So there was a convent on one side with nuns and a monastery with monks on the other. And they wished to dissolve. They wanted a great number of the monks and nuns wanted to come out and do other things. And this was especially poignant for the nuns because it was not at all uncommon for families to stick kind of awkward daughters, not personally awkward, but if they have like 7 daughters or something, they don't want to pay dowries for all of them. Or if they have a politically inconvenient daughter, where if she were to get married to an ambitious person, that person might challenge for the throne or something along those lines. It was not at all uncommon to stick that inconvenient woman into a convent. And then she'd live a life there, but she would be chosen for her, and it wouldn't necessarily be something she wanted, but that would be where she would be stuck. And so there were a great number of nuns, very likely, who were eager to come out of the convent and pursue a different kind of life. Unfortunately, this was a little bit of an awkward problem. Monks are highly educated. They can easily come out of the monastery and just find work like Martin Luther did, teaching or doing any one of a number of occupations that their education prepares them for. Nuns may have special crafting skills. That's a lot of what they did to like make money for the monastery. Monks did things like brew beer and make wine, and nuns do that too. They also make lace and other kind of fancy clothing and whatnot. They might have special skills, but they're unmarried women. And this made a social problem in the 1500s because there really weren't positions in society for just unmarried ladies. If you were a widow or if you were married, then there were lots of jobs you might do. But it was just considered scandalous and not something that was socially acceptable for somebody to just be a single lady, move into town and open up a bake shop, for instance. It just wasn't done. So in order to provide a way for the nuns to live respectable lives, Martin Luther suggests that the monks who are leaving the monastery should marry the nuns who are leaving the convent, and that way provide them with protection and provide them with respectable social status so they can go out and make the most of their education and their skills. And so there's an account that he does this with one of these double monasteries, and he kind of like people line up like kickball, and the monks and nuns are like choosing across the aisle, like randomly who's going to be their spouse from now on. And the end of that process, there was one nun left over, Katharina von Bora, and Martin Luther marries her himself. And apparently their marriage was very successful. They have several children and write letters back and forth to each other that are very fond. I don't know. But at any rate, He supports marriage. He does not support celibacy. He does not support this idea of clerical hierarchy at all. He also challenges the idea that good works of penance. So if you were to say, I've been a bad person my whole life, but if I'll go on crusade, or I'll go on pilgrimage, or I'll do some kind of thing that has been suggested to me, I'll build a annex to the church or something, and then I'll be forgiven my sins and rewarded with heaven for having done that good work. Luther says, no, 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 that doesn't work. You can't just do things and get rewarded for it and go into heaven, because the fact is, humans are fallible. They're limited. We're not anything like God and can't be anything like God. God is infinite. God is all powerful. God is all knowing. God is all that is goodness. And so therefore, human beings can't possibly ever deserve to be part of this. We can't deserve to be saved. We can't deserve salvation. We can't deserve kind of eternal life. That's ridiculous. Nothing you do could ever add up to deserving that. So the only way you achieve salvation is through faith alone, according to Luther. He says that you can't ever think you're going to earn your way into heaven. You can't. Nothing you do could ever be that good. Instead, you just have to have faith, and God will give you access to heaven by his grace. You don't deserve it, but he'll give it to you anyway, as long as you've got faith. That's the idea. So we're only using the scriptures as our authority, and we put trust in faith alone, not in any kind of good works. Okay. Then he goes after some of the practical things the Lollards had problems with. He's like, we should not have church services in Latin. We should translate the Bible into local languages so that people all have access. If Scripture is our only authority, everybody needs to have access to Scripture so that they know what it says and can make up their mind. And the same thing goes for church services. Everybody needs to know what's going on. They need to evaluate what the teaching is and whether it conforms to scriptural teaching. So, okay, the last thing I should go on. Luther does not advocate for the total getting rid of clergy. He suggests that there should still be ministers, people who have kind of special status, but that these should be chosen by the community as people with special education and special qualifications. And they don't have any holy or supernatural status with God, but they should still exist in order to organize church services, in order to organize all of the things the Catholic Church traditionally did, keeping records, organizing care for the poor. All of that should go forward, and there should still be a church structure. It's just that we should stop believing that clergy have any special status or powers. Okay, so Luther's ideas are going to catch on, as I mentioned before, like wild. And there's going to be a whole bunch of other, often ex-clergy, who've been sitting on the same kinds of ideas. And the minute the door is cracked open, they all come shoving through it. There's going to be dozens and dozens of people who pop up everywhere, that some of them are going to join with Luther, some of them are going to argue with Luther, some of them are going to be kind of similar to Luther, but doing their own thing. And there's going to just be a wave of religious reformers. And this whole movement is going to be known as the Protestant Reformation. Protestant because they're protesting the way the Catholic Church has been running, and Reformation because their argument is that they are reforming the church, that the church needs to be broken down, dissolved, and formed again in a new way. So there's going to be a bunch of different reformers, and they all have their own motivations and their own particular quirks. Ulrich Zwingli, you're not going to need to know very much about him. Theologically, he agrees more or less with Luther. He's on the same page on most issues. However, he's going to be a little different, and that's the reason he gets his own slide here, because Zwingli argues that it's not possible to work with the existing political system. Luther's trying to do that. He's trying to work with Frederick the Wise. Zwingli says, look, that's a lost cause. It's never going to work out. You can't put your faith in that. The traditional royal system is just totally enmeshed with the church. We're never going to peel these two things apart. And so the only way you're going to create a true reformed church, the only way you're going to have real change, is if you separate them out, so that you break with the traditional political structure and form a new type of community that's led by the leaders of the church, that's led by the leaders of this new church movement. that has broken from Catholicism. So he puts forward that idea and is going to form a community in Zurich, which is in Switzerland. Switzerland is particularly amenable to this kind of thing because each of the cantons is individual and self-governing, and they have a long tradition of resisting the rule of overlords like the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. So he moves to Zurich, and he and his followers end up making up a majority of the town, and they just kind of take it over and run the place as a community that's governed around the principles of this new Reformed church. Okay, so among those who are going to be leaving the church for religious reasons, there are going to be people who leave the church for non-religious reasons as well. And probably the poster child for this is Henry VIII of England. Now, in his youth, he was such a staunch proponent, such a defender of the Catholic Church, that the Pope actually gives him a special recognition title as Defender of the Faith, because he was absolutely attached to and had no problem at all with Catholic doctrine, with the authority structure of the Catholic Church. He really liked everything about being Catholic until he started having personal marital problems. So this is where we are with Henry. Now, I'm going to try to think about how I can put this in the most succinct way possible. Henry VIII's personal career is quite colorful. He comes to power. He inherits after his father, Henry VII. Henry VII had come to power as the leader of a new family, a new dynasty known as the Tudors, after a period of nasty, bitter civil war in England. And so the dynasty is not all that secure. And so Henry VII impresses it on his sons that it is vitally important, once they become king, that the succession, the next king to come after them, is really locked down and tight, that they have a successor that comes after them that the rest of the nobility of England will accept. This is something reinforced on Henry from the time he was a boy. Then things start to get complicated. Ready? Henry is a second son. He had an older brother named Arthur. Arthur was the sickly kid, but nevertheless, a marriage was arranged for him when he was just a young boy with a young princess from Spain, Catherine of Aragon. Her parents are Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, of Columbus fame, and of the Alhambra decree fame, and the Inquisition, and all that kind of jazz. She's their daughter. They're closely tied to the Habsburg family. Once they pass away, her nephew is going to become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. So she's got really, really strong political ties. She's super rich. Her family's super powerful. She's got a lot going for her. So this was a prize to have been won for England. When she's still a young girl, she travels to England with her entourage to live in the palace. This is before she's technically married to Arthur. Because they're still too young, they're kids. So the marriage is arranged, but they haven't gone through with it yet. She learns to speak English. She becomes very popular with the English people because there she is. She's the princess. She's been hanging around. So here's what happens. Arthur dies. And they'd technically been married at this point, Arthur and Catherine. But he had always been sickly, and they were both very young. And Henry is determined. He does not want to lose this alliance, nor, it seems, did he want to let go of the idea of Catherine herself. Catherine was a few years older than him, 4 or 5. But he and she had always gotten along very well, and so he feels it's the greatest idea ever if he, the younger brother, just marries her. And that way they keep everything in the family. That'll be great. Unfortunately for Henry, the church had rules about this. You're not allowed to marry your brother's widow, according to the Catholic Church. So he has to go appeal for special dispensation. And Catherine had to appear in court, and she had to sign a sworn statement that said that even though they were legally married and living in the same place, she and Arthur had never consummated the marriage. They'd never actually slept together because he was sickly and she was young, and that's how it went. And so therefore, they weren't really married. The church buys this. The Pope issues them an annulment, saying it is as if their marriage never happened, legally speaking. And so therefore, they issue a special document to Henry saying there is no legal reason you can't marry Catherine. So he does. And they have about 20 years together. of marriage. And in most respects, their marriage was quite successful up until the end. He and Catherine get along very well. They write letters back and forth to each other that are very fond. She is put in charge of some military actions that she does really well. He really admires. They're a great couple for years. The one downside to it is that Catherine doesn't have a son, or rather, they do, but they have several children that die really young in infancy, which is not at all uncommon. They have a lot of miscarriages and stillbirths. They have one living child, a daughter, Mary, and then a slew of just tragedy for the rest of their reproductive lives. It doesn't work out. And after about 20 years, it becomes clear to everyone that Catherine is not going to survive another pregnancy, that she's not going to have a son. And so Henry is now in a position where he's starting to feel very pressured, and he's very anxious. One, he wants a male heir. He's got some illegitimate sons. He wants a male heir, however, he wants a legitimate male son. On top of that, he's got a mistress he's got his eye on. And she's not quite a mistress, Anne Boleyn. He's got a flirtation with this chick. He did sleep with her sister for a while, but he's got a flirtation going with Anne Boleyn, but she won't actually sleep with him because she claims that she's too religious and she can't possibly sleep with someone who's not her husband. She's pressuring him to break off the marriage with Catherine. He wants to break off the marriage with Catherine because of the whole son issue. On top of that, there were people in England who wanted to see Henry break with the Catholic Church because they wanted to do this for religious reasons, some of them. They wanted to have a church that was more like Luther's church. Some of them wanted to do it for political reasons because they felt that the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy was too powerful and too much a rival to their own power. So there are people who are pushing for a break with the church. His mistress is pushing him to leave his wife. His wife, of course, is not taking any of this lying down. She refuses to go quietly, and she's making scenes about the whole thing. Once he starts floating the idea of annulling their marriage, she goes kicking and screaming into fits about it and embarrasses him and causes all kinds of problems. And it's just a mess. And eventually Henry's like, okay, I can do this. He applies to the Catholic Church first, and he's like, hey, can I have a divorce? Can I have an annulment from Catherine? And the Pope says, no. 2 reasons. Her family is super powerful. Her nephew's the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm not doing that. No, she doesn't want this. So I'm going to side with her and her family. And 2, the office of the papacy has already issued a statement about this marriage. We've already issued you that document that said there's no reason you can't be married. So we're not annulling it now. We've already spoken. That's it. You're married to her. Sorry. Henry at this point decides he's not going to listen. So he breaks with the Catholic Church and creates the Church of England. Once he does that, he immediately grants himself a divorce, puts Catherine of Aragon aside, and marries Anne Boleyn. He, for an instant, thinks everything is going to go great. Anne Boleyn gets pregnant right away. He's like, now I can do what I want to do with the church hierarchy. This is going to be fantastic. But problems spring up almost as quickly. Henry doesn't really have any interest in the Protestant theologians like Luther and Zwingli and Calvin. We'll get to him in a bit, next week probably. He doesn't really have any interest in changing the doctrine of the church. He really wants it to look just like the Catholic Church, but have the king in charge of it. That's what his goal is. So there are Protestants in England who are like, yay, we've broken with the Catholic Church. But boo, he's not actually changing anything. They're mad at him because he's not Protestant enough. On the flip side, the great majority of people in England are still Catholic, and they're mad at him because he broke with the Catholic Church. So he's getting this from both sides. On top of that, he's getting pressure from Catherine's family. On top of that, the Boleyns, Anne Boleyn's family, turn out to be a bunch of politically ambitious money grubbers who are causing him all kinds of headaches. And everything starts to turn sour. Anne Boleyn's pregnancy ends in the birth of a daughter, and Henry immediately starts regretting his decision. He's like, oh, shoot. I've made possibly a terrible mistake here. But things kind of continue. They carry on for a little bit longer. Anne Boleyn gets pregnant again. And then things start going south. He starts losing interest in her. She miscarries. It was a boy. He's losing interest in her. She's desperate to hang on to him. At some point, and this is just a theory, it's one of those pet pieces of trivia, he was out showing off. He was very athletic in his youth. You wouldn't necessarily know it from the portrait, but he was very athletic in his youth. He loved sports and sporting activities, and he was participating in a joust for fun. He takes a bad fall off his horse and he's knocked unconscious, and he stays unconscious for hours, and he's so deeply unresponsive that people thought he was dead, and there was a panic and they go running for the queen. It's a whole big deal. He does wake up, but after that, he seems to have undergone something of a personality shift. He'd always had a temper, but it gets really out of control after this. He starts going into rages over minor things. He starts fighting with people he'd always gotten along with. His marriage to Anne Boleyn is basically toast. He's decided he's made a terrible mistake. He blames her. He doesn't like it. He manages to trump up really most likely completely fabricated charges of treason against her on the grounds that she's sleeping with other men, which she probably was not, and has her executed. Then he goes on to a series of other marriages. He does manage to have a son with his third wife, Jane, but she dies in childbirth as a result of childbirth. So after that, there's going to be a wife that he marries by proxy, where nobody really wants to marry him after he goes through the first three. And he's got a reputation for being kind of crazy, and he's in this weird political position where he's sort of Protestant, sort of not. And so she's Anne of Cleves, and she looks at a portrait of him, and it's like, yeah, he looks all right. He looks at a portrait of her, and he's like, yeah, she looks pretty cute. And they get off on the wrong foot, and they don't like each other, and he's kind of got a type, and she's not his type. She was not ugly. Historians sometimes will make the mistake of repeating Henry's opinion that she was not attractive, but that's not true. It's just that you can probably tell from looking at Catherine and Anne here, he had a type. He liked small, petite, pale, fair-haired women who basically liked his sense of humor. Anne of Cleves was tall and dark and buxom and not playing his game. And so he didn't like her, she didn't like him, and so that marriage really was annulled. And then she gets the best deal out of all of them because she gets a nice estate and she gets to not be married to the king, and it's great. Then he marries again, and she does cheat on him, and she gets executed, and then he finally marries a woman who outlives him. So it's a disaster. There's all these strings of wives, and that conflict between the church and the government is not ever reconciled. Catholics are still mad at him for breaking the church. Protestants are still mad at him for not being Protestant enough. It's just a gigantic headache for him, and he gets kind of wilder and more erratic during his entire career. Another sort of piece of trivia, he was famous. He's sort of famously associated with one of the nursery rhymes. English nursery rhymes very often refer to historical events, like Ring Around the Rosie is a reference to the Black Death. Pocket full of posy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down, is a reference to the Black Death. Little Jack Horner, if you've ever heard that, Little Jack Horner sat in the corner eating a Christmas pie, put in his thumb, pulled out a plum, and said, "What a good boy am I." That's actually a reference to an incident involving Henry's dissolution of monastic property in England in 1536. Now, he'd made himself the head of the Church of England, but then there was a long drawn out process where he negotiated what exactly that meant. And in 1536, what he does is he seizes the property held by the church, all monasteries in England. He seizes it for the government, and it ends up being very profitable for him, but very unpopular with not just Catholics in England, but Catholics outside of England too. They're furious about the whole thing. There's a great deal of political pushback, and there's some irregularities. And this is just a piece of trivia. I don't necessarily know it, but we're going to end our lecture here. Little Jack Horner nursery rhyme seems to be a reference to a guy named Jack Horner, who was the steward. He was basically the administrative assistant of the last abbot of Glastonbury. Glastonbury was a big monastery. They owned a lot of properties. And the abbot of Glastonbury decided, in order to try to keep Henry from seizing absolutely everything they had and taking all of their resources away, he tries to negotiate. And so he sends a bunch of title deeds of various properties to the king in order to bribe him into leaving other properties alone. Now, because these properties are just title deeds and they're just signed and anybody who holds them can claim to own that property, it was considered necessary to hide the fact that Jack Horner was traveling with them by concealing them inside a pie. So somebody made a pie crust and they stuck these things in there. So it's not like gooey with pie, it's just, a crust. That way, if he was robbed on the road, robbers would be like, pie, we don't want that, and leave it alone. So they put the title deeds inside the pie. And on the way, we're not sure exactly what happened, but the pie is delivered. Henry takes the deeds. The abbot of Glastonbury assumes that these properties are gone now because they've been given to Henry. Henry assumes that he's gotten every deed that the abbot of Glastonbury gives him. But then all of a sudden, Jack Horner has the title deed to a place called Mel's Manor. And it's a rich, lovely property, and he just kind of keeps it, and his family keeps it and still lives there now. And it's very likely that what he did and what the nursery rhyme refers to is that he was traveling along, opens up the pie, pulls out a title deed, puts it in his own pocket, and then continues on. So that's just a fun little story piece of trivia. It's possibly true, it might not be true, one never knows, but the process of changing from a Europe in which everybody is Catholic to one where there are a number of rival churches, political institutions, personal motives, it ends up being enormously chaotic. It ends up being a period of tremendously dynamic and often very violent change. So we're going to pick up here next time. We're going to start talking about some of the other leaders of Protestant movements, John Calvin, the Anabaptist, for instance, and we will talk about the Catholic response to all of this change and breaking away next time. Thanks for watching.